Okay, hi. So excited to be here. For those streaming from Mirabella, wonderful for you to be here with us today. And to have back with us Kyle Lascurettes from Lewis and Clark College. He is going to be talking through multilateral organizations in a changing world order. And just briefly, Kyle is Associate Professor of International Affairs and Department Chair at Lewis and Clark College. He specializes and teaches classes in international relations theory, global order, international organizations, and international security. And his first book, Orders of Exclusion, was published by Oxford University Press in 2020 and received the Jervis Schroeder Prize for Best Book in International History and Politics, presented by the American Political Science Association. So he knows what he's talking about. Give him a big hand.
Hi everyone, thanks for that warm introduction, Tim. I'm thrilled to be here. I was here a couple of years ago. Maybe some of you were here as well. I was talking about NATO. I'm going to talk about NATO a little bit today too. The test today is quite a bit harder though. Instead of talking about one institution, it seems that I'm talking about all the institutions out there. And so, I thought that the readings were interesting. They spoke to the United Nations and to the Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. I'm going to go even a little bit broader than that. And so I thought what I would do here today is talk about kind of the sum total of the major global international institutions or organizations of the world that are often talked about and grouped under this broad heading called the liberal international order. And so say a word about that and kind of this framework and kind of the assumptions that guide a lot of the U.S. government in thinking about this, if not also the world. And then just do a really quick crash course on some of the most visible and well-known of the international organizations or institutions that are a part of this liberal order. Then talk about some ways in which we can diagnose major challenges or problems to these organizations, to be able to say something about how they are under strain today. So I'll give us a general framework for thinking about challenges to international organizations, and then go back through briefly the 5 or so major organizations that I'm going to talk about, to talk about arguably what ails them today, some of the problems they have. And then hopefully we have plenty of time for questions and discussion, because there's a lot here that we can talk about. So the liberal international order, it's a phrase that gets used a lot today. It's a focus of my research. It's a hot topic in international affairs circles, both on the academic side of things, also on the policy-making side of things. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but generally, this is the definition that I think most people kind of operate from. When we talk about a liberal international order, a liberal world order, sometimes in Washington, D.C., and in the U.S. government in particular, they talk about a rules-based international order. We're often talking about the same thing, and it's the web of international organizations created after World War II by the West, but primarily led by the hegemonic preponderant power coming out of the Second World War, the United States of America. And that these institutions and organizations are generally believed to have done all sorts of public good things for the world, promoted international peace, free trade, economic stability and multilateralism, as well as promoting liberal principles of openness and governance, shared power, both within countries, so spreading democratic principles of governance, but also across countries in the international system throughout the post-World War II era. And some of the idea behind this is that the United States of America chose to do something quite different with its preponderant power, and actually something quite a bit better than what previous great powers or hegemonic powers have done at these moments of opportunity. It decided to, in a lot of ways, bind its own power and its own strength through creating a series of formal international rules. And that's really all like international organizations are. It's writing down, it's making official, it's codifying international rules, and then creating oftentimes these organizational structures to enforce the rules and kind of have a central forum for making sure these principles of government are being carried out. And so, advocates of this kind of approach, champions of multilateral institutions, will say, well, how has history changed over time? They would say this is one of the single most important pieces of data that I could show you about how international affairs or international relations has changed over time. The rise, or we could say relative explosion of formal international organizations. And as you can see, a little bit dated here in terms of the cutoff, but the big jump, it's not a coincidence that it takes place in and especially after World War II. Kind of the age of the liberal international order is an age of institutionalized multilateral relations, where, in other words, there are fewer and fewer times when countries are just on their own to coordinate and attempt to cooperate with other countries in an ad hoc manner. Countries are interacting with each other more and more through these organized rules, organizations, and processes. And the theory behind international organizations is they help kind of grease the wheels of cooperation and coordination for countries to achieve their common interests. The entire appeal of multilateral institutions and organizations is supposed to be that there are mutual gains that countries of the world can achieve out there if only they can find a way to trust each other and coordinate and cooperate enough and overcome some of the mistrust, some of the fear, some of the apprehension that comes with an international system that doesn't have a world government, that has an absence of authority. And so international organizations, the promise of them is that they help countries realize mutually beneficial gains, or what are oftentimes called collective goods or public goods. That is, things that help all countries that participate in them. And so what I'm going to do is go through a bit of the history and a number of the most visible and prominent of the international organizations or institutions of the liberal order of the post-war world before talking about some problems. And when I teach about the liberal international order, when I teach about the founding of some of the most visible international organizations after World War II, I always put up this slide and this timeline that I'm going to be coming back to a couple of times here. So a lot of information on here that you don't have to absorb all at once. I'll highlight each of these developments in turn. And just why I like when I'm talking about history operating with using timelines and kind of showing important dates and developments. And one of the things that this really shows is just how important the 1940s were for the evolution of the international system, the world, as we are still dealing with it and grappling with it today. If you think of the later parts of the 1700s, when the United States of America had a constitutional convention, you can think of the 1940s as really another constitutional convention, but it's a constitutional convention of the world rather than just of a single country. And rather than it just being a bunch of statesmen meeting in one place for a single meeting, this unfolded across multiple meetings in multiple different fora at different points in the 1940s. But really, like, talking about these organizations that we're gonna grapple with here today, and that the world is still contending with and acting through, I still find it historically remarkable that they were all created in such a relatively short period of time. Just a really remarkable decade, and really, really interesting here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to highlight and give a bit of a crash course in some of these major organizations before talking about some of the problems and headwinds that they're facing today. So first, maybe the organization that we all know the best, or that we hear the most about, the United Nations. The United Nations, founded officially at the United Nations Conference on International Organization in San Francisco in the spring into the summer of 1945, that produced the UN Charter. The United Nations goes into effect officially when enough countries ratify it in early 1946. And so for each of these organizations, I mean, it goes without saying, we could have an entire session, we could have multiple sessions on just the United Nations or on just NATO or those kinds of things. So I'm going to play pretty fast and loose with these organizations, but just give you kind of a general sense of at least the theory behind them, the collective goods that are supposed to be provided. So what is the UN supposed to do? The UN, first and foremost, is supposed to provide collective security, pooled security amongst all members of the UN against threats to international peace and stability and security. So it's supposed to be a collective security organization. But it's also meant to promote economic and social development, both within countries and member states, but also across member states in the international system. Finally, it is meant to be an international organization that serves as a central hub to all other international treaties, international laws. And one of the interesting things about the UN that we don't often hear about, but it is still a central repository for countries for UN members to register all other international agreements they make, whether it's like multilateral security guarantee or just a bilateral trade agreement with other countries. And so it's kind of the first amongst equals of international organizations. And I'm not going to do this for each one of these organizations, but because the UN is kind of a super organization, these are the six major organs and kind of the big organizational structure of what the UN looks like. I am not going to talk about most of them, but I thought I would say a word on at least the two most visible and well-known and arguably the two most important organs of the UN here. And the first one is the UN General Assembly, or UNGA. And this is a picture of the UNGA at UN headquarters in New York, New York. And United Nations General Assembly it is often said, people often talk about, world leaders talk about, well, the international community wants this, or the international community opposes that. And the international community itself is an abstraction. There is no international community sitting out there in some giant auditorium, okay? There is no parliament of the world. But this, the UNGA, is the closest thing we have to a parliament of the world, okay? It is a forum where no matter how big or small, significant or insignificant you are as a country, it is one country, one vote. Okay, so it is the ultimate democratic forum on the international stage. Much of the work of the General Assembly, many of the votes that the General Assembly take, are symbolic votes, are non-binding votes. Yet they're often also treated as very important for the countries involved, even if they are symbolic and non-binding. But I would just say the UN General Assembly is probably most visible and in the news, making headlines the most. Each September, when the annual session of the UNGA kicks off. And that's where the leaders of any United Nations member is invited to UN headquarters in New York. and allowed to address the General Assembly, allowed to give a speech representing their country and their country's perspectives. Now, like there's no guarantee that giving a speech is going to get you more respect or that it's going to get your pet issues or grievances a hearing in the UN, and yet oftentimes we see the vast majority of countries sending their leaders, their representatives to the UN because this organization is seen as legitimate and has some amount of legitimacy. And like I said, this is the closest thing to being able to say that as a leader, as a president or prime minister or what have you, that you are addressing like the international community, a parliament of the world. And so that becomes important for countries. That said, when it comes to the UN's original founding purpose, collective security, and specifically dealing with threats to international peace and security, it's not the General Assembly that is the main event. It is this other organization, the UN Security Council, or UNSC. And the UN Security Council really has a truly awesome power. A lot of people know that it gets to decide how the UN responds to threats to international peace and security. And so it does that on behalf of all UN members. But the even more awesome power, in my mind, is that the UN Charter gives the Security Council the right to determine what constitutes a threat to international peace and security in the first place. So they not only get to decide the response to those threats, but they get to define what constitutes that kind of threat in the first place. And it's a relatively small body, okay? There are only 15 members. 10 of them are rotating. There's a regional representation system. They're elected in the UN General Assembly. They serve 2-year terms. But arguably what gets talked about, the real main event of the Security Council, is the P5, the permanent 5 members that were seen as 5 great powers or particularly influential states at the end of World War II. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia are the P5. And those are the countries that have, the only members of the Security Council that have permanent membership and a veto power, an unconditional veto. Now, they can't block the Security Council from merely debating and talking about any issue, but they can veto, they can block any resolutions, any actions on the part of the Security Council. And so what you'll often see, in recent years, there's been a number of UN Security Council heated sessions about the Russia-Ukraine war, for instance. And Russia would very much like for those not to happen, okay? But it can't actually block the discussion of it. What it can block are any concrete, tangible resolutions coming out of the Security Council, either labeling that a threat to international peace and security, or especially then doing something about it, or calling on the UN to do something about it. And so a lot of times in the Security Council, votes are technically determined by, you need a 9/15 majority to pass anything, but it's oftentimes not, the hang-up is oftentimes not getting to 9 states. It's the fact that even if you have 14 out of 15 members that are in favor of passing a resolution, if that one holdout is one of the P5, it ain't happening, okay? It's not going to pass. That's what permanent membership and especially having the unconditional veto is, okay? So that's the UN. Now, last time I was here, a couple years ago, I talked about this institution, but the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO, was started off really as an alliance, thought more of an alliance. It's really an alliance and an international organization that represents unprecedented security cooperation amongst its members, which are primarily democracies roughly geographically situated in the North Atlantic. And so the collective goods provided, I say collective security and military cooperation against threats to democracy democracies of the North Atlantic. So it's an organization that is based on kind of common membership, common principles of governance and common values. But it is also very tangibly supposed to be a collective security organization. Now you might say to yourself, well, wait, isn't you just said the UN is a collective security organization. Technically speaking, the UN is a collective security organization. In practice, I would say nobody really believes anymore that the UN actually takes collective security seriously. Collective security means, in its actual definition, that members kind of pool their security or pool their sovereignty, where an attack against any one member of a collective security pact is supposed to be treated by all members as if they themselves had been attacked, and then respond accordingly, okay? With the UN, like the vast majority of countries of the world, that's not, nobody's believing that with the UN, okay? They are believing that with NATO, or at least up until now, or up until recently, that has been the promise. The most famous provision of the North Atlantic Treaty that established NATO is its famous Article 5, which is the collective security promise. And so whenever you hear NATO talked about and debated, you're probably going to hear about Article 5 that says an attack against one member is an attack against all members. And so, NATO was founded primarily between the United States and its principal allies at the time in Western Europe. It's since pushed into Central and even Eastern Europe, the former Soviet zone. And it was meant to provide a security guarantee for many of those European states by the United States to protect against an attack by the Soviet Union. A lot of people thought NATO was going to go away once the Cold War ended. It didn't go away. Arguably, it became even more important and visible, and it expanded its membership. So that is NATO. So even before World War II ended, actually the organizations that were founded first here were founded at a conference known as the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, oftentimes now just referred to as the Bretton Woods Conference, because they took place in Bretton Woods, at the Bretton Woods Resort in New Hampshire. And that's the reason they're called the Bretton Woods organizations, just because they were founded there. Has anybody in the room been to the Bretton Woods Resort? You can go there skiing. It's lovely. So, quick aside, I wasn't going, which is always dangerous. I tell my students when I have a quick aside that I wasn't planning on saying something. A couple of years ago, about 2.5 years ago, I got married, and I'm from upstate New York, and I went back to upstate New York not to get married, but to have a bachelor weekend with a couple of my old friends. And they said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to go to New Hampshire and I want to climb Mount Washington. But also, before I do that, I want to nerd out and stay at the Bretton Woods Resort in New Hampshire and go around and get the tour and like look at all the plaques and stuff like that." And so we did that, and all my friends, a lot of these were like lifelong childhood friends, they were like, "Dude, you are so lame. This is so lame right now." So, but I thought it was cool. It's a lovely place. I recommend it to you, okay? Even if you don't give a care about the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But that's what was founded there, okay? Two of the core organizations, economic and financial organizations of the post-war era. And really, like the philosophy behind the IMF and the World Bank and the reason for this conference in the first place was one of the big causes of World War II was determined to be the global Great Depression, and really the lack of any kind of economic, financial, monetary coordination between countries that, while it didn't cause the Great Depression, it certainly made it worse, and it certainly made it global. And many countries of the world, many leaders of the world determined quite reasonably that perhaps we wouldn't have gotten the rise of fascist governments and the aggression and violence and bloodshed and displacement that took place if we had not had kind of the bottom fallout of any kind of system of multilateral coordination on economic, financial, and monetary systems. And so that's what the IMF and the World Bank are why they were created. And so like what they do today, and these are incredibly complex, complicated organizations that each employ thousands of economics PhDs. And so they're incredibly technical and complicated organizations. I'm not going to be able to do them justice here. But what I can say is that they are meant to provide they're meant to provide in some ways a social safety net for the international system. And for countries of the international system that really need help. And they both do this through making large loans to countries in need. The International Monetary Fund oftentimes gives shorter-term loans, and it tends to loan to countries facing economic financial crises. And it does so for the purpose of saying even when countries are in dire financial straits, a collective or public good for the countries of the world, including that country in trouble, is to keep the relative value of countries' national currencies in line with one another. So when we talk about stabilizing international exchange rates, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about keeping the dollar in a predictable and relatively stable proportion to the euro, to the peso, to what have you. Because everything we know about the Great Depression and hard economic times internationally suggests that when currencies are volatile and they are wildly fluctuating relative to currencies in other countries, and that is unpredictable looking into the near future, not to mention the distant future, that is when all sorts of international economic exchange, investment, speculation, and so on, all dries up. The market hates volatility, the market hates unpredictability. And so that's why the IMF provides loans to help even when countries are facing dire economic conditions, balance of payment crises, and so on. It's like a rainy day fund that kind of helps countries stabilize things without the bottom falling out on exchange rates. The World Bank tends to also makes loans to countries in need, but it tends to act in more normal times, not as much crisis, and it gives much longer-term loans. And it gives loans to countries primarily of the global south, developing countries, less well-off countries, we can say, for the purpose of funding major development projects in those countries, often years-long or even decades-long projects. When I say development projects, it could be everything from infrastructure, building new highways or highway systems, building giant dams that are going to vastly reshape the landscape of major parts of the country and provide power, building new electrical grids for countries. Not to mention, development also includes like major social programs and improvements, building or rebuilding a healthcare system for a country, or even just drastically reorganizing the federal or national government of countries to better serve the needs of the peoples. And so that is, in a nutshell, in a very simplified view, what the collective goods that are meant to be provided by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Next, this looks interesting. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, successfully negotiated in Geneva, Switzerland. This is the GATT. This is the precursor to the modern World Trade Organization. It was never meant to be the precursor to the modern World Trade Organization. There was actually supposed to be something called the International Trade Organization that had a conference in Cuba, in Havana, Cuba in 1948, and they successfully negotiated a charter for this thing. It didn't get off the ground. Not enough countries, including the United States, opposed it for various reasons. And so those that were interested in kind of a global free trade institution or regime had to go back to the drawing board. And what they did was they said, well, we got this kind of like this agreement amongst a much smaller grouping of countries that was kind of sleepily negotiated in Geneva, Switzerland already a couple of years earlier, a free trade pact. Let's make that the basis of a global free trade organization going forward. And that's precisely what they did, and they kept building on the GATT over the years, over the decades from 1947 on, all the way up until the mid-1990s when the GATT officially becomes the World Trade Organization, or WTO. And so a lot of times when I talk about the WTO, I call it the GATT WTO because that's the lineage there. And the main goal of this organization is relatively straightforward. It is to promote as much free trade around the world as possible. The idea behind it is that free trade, where everybody gets to specialize in that which they have a comparative advantage in, that they are able to make most cheaply. If I make what I can produce most cheaply and efficiently, and you do the same, and then we're allowed to exchange those things for one another on an open market, unfettered by tariffs, taxes, or other non-tariff barriers to trade, then great, we all get more things for less utility, for less time. Everybody ends up better off. And then finally, I'll mention here the European Union. So this is controversial. This makes it look like the United States created the European Union. I would say that that's not technically true, except to say that when the United States decided to administer Marshall Plan aid, unprecedented infusion of aid into Europe, it was important for the United States, it said, that it not just give this out bilaterally on a country-by-country basis to Europe. The United States, one of the conditions for this aid was that the countries of Europe needed to work more closely together. The belief was that, especially with the looming Soviet communist threat, that if Europe remained divided and kind of at each other's throats, these countries were never going to survive the kind of Soviet communist menace coming from the East. And so the United States incentivized these countries to work together. And you can arguably say that we can draw kind of a lightly dotted line from that to then the decades of European cooperation that end up taking place. And what we end up getting eventually is a European Union, where we see really unprecedented levels of cooperation and coordination, and I would say later integration between the nation states of Europe in really unprecedented ways. So it started off as economic cooperation, but it's obviously gone much beyond that. Much to the point where Europe has gotten rid of a lot of the traditional barriers that really define what sovereign states, independent states are, and they've pooled their sovereignty in a lot of unprecedented ways. Okay, so that's a crash course in some of the most visible institutions and their purposes of the liberal international order. And I was trying to think about here how we can talk about challenges and problems with these organizations, headwinds that they are facing today. And I would say, so I tried to imperfectly characterize challenges into three categories here. I think we can talk about challenges of representation, that is, issues having to do with voting power in a world of shifting influence, where who was powerful in the 1940s does not correspond anymore with who is powerful now. Okay, so a crisis in that regard. A crisis having to do with issues related to division, so just issues related to a growing divergence of interests amongst members of that international organization. And then finally, maybe the most serious here, crises, challenges, problems of purpose, issues related to the core mission or function of the international organization, why that organization was founded in the first place. And I will just say, you know, my diagnosis here. With the United Nations, I would say that current challenges, we have issues of representation, not in the General Assembly. Countries like one country, one vote. What they really hate is the P5, the permanent membership and the veto power in the Security Council. There is tremendous dissatisfaction with the P5 and the veto power. And I think specifically the fact that if we were going to redo the Security Council today and just have 5 members, we'd probably have the United States, China, and even Russia. Probably would not have the United Kingdom and France in there, okay? So there's a big fear of illegitimacy in representation in the Security Council. Maybe one of the reasons the Security Council is at a standstill. I would also say there's emerging issues of division in the General Assembly between countries' diverging interests, countries of the global north and countries of the so-called global south, between previously developed countries and developing countries. And we also see emerging divides in the UN Security Council, primarily between the so-called Western powers, the United States, Britain, and France, that, especially post-Cold War, have wanted to take a much more liberal and expansive view of what constitutes a threat to international peace and security, defining things like civil wars and human rights issues and even environmental challenges as those kinds of threats. And the Eastern powers, the autocratic powers, China and Russia, being much more fearful defenders of traditional concepts of sovereignty and freedom of action for countries. In the case of NATO, I think we see divisions between, unprecedented divisions under the Trump administration, Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0, between the United States and its allies. I think the Trump administration, Trump himself personally, has questioned whether we need NATO at all, but also questioning whether NATO members are pulling their fair share or not. It seems that we've averted the crisis over the impending invasion of Greenland, which is good, hopefully, but I would say tensions between the United States and its NATO allies are still at a historical high point, generally speaking. But I would say maybe the more serious challenge for NATO right now is, do members still believe in a common identity? Do they still take their Article 5 commitments seriously? And I know for a fact that that's what a lot of the European states are worried about when it comes to the United States. If we were to be attacked by, say, Russia today, will the United States actually honor its Article 5 commitments to come to our defense as if they themselves had been attacked too? And so I think number two here is perhaps the more serious challenge for NATO today. The Bretton Woods institutions here. I would say issues of representation. So both of these organizations operate not on a one country, one vote system, but on a weighted voting system that basically determines the size and influence of their economy for global markets. And so the United States is the only country with kind of de facto veto power in both of these organizations because it represents somewhere, it's got about 17% voting shares. Well, a lot of countries of the world say these organizations have traditionally been dominated by the global north or the global west, kind of developed powers, and they have disproportionate influence in here. Oh, and by the way, weighted voting is not only undemocratic, but it's inaccurate. It hasn't been updated nearly enough as the nature of the international economy, and we've seen the rise of new economic powers in the world that are underrepresented in this organization. But also the purpose of these organizations. The IMF and the World Bank are perhaps most controversial today for, in making their loans, they have attached more and more conditions to these loans over time. And a lot of the conditions have to do with principles of good governance, things that the IMF and the World Bank say good, responsible countries need to do domestically, revising their domestic system, opening themselves up to more trade internationally, and so on. And there has just been, for decades now, growing dissatisfaction, sometimes outright rebellion, against this kind of one-size-fits-all liberal or neoliberal model that the IMF and the World Bank and all of their expert economists are said to be trying to force upon countries of the world in taking these loans. And the loans themselves are often today treated much like predatory loans are in the United States or domestically, okay, kind of hostile loans in a lot of ways. The World Trade Organization, so I think has some challenges on all three fronts, all three kinds of problems here. Representation, so this is another organization, World Trade Organization is kind of fascinating It is formally meant to be one country, one vote, like the UN General Assembly. In practice, though, its agenda gets determined outside of formal channels and has over the decades been determined by a cabal of the usual suspects, the United States, the United Kingdom, a number of other influential countries, the European Union, Canada, and Japan have been a part of this. Well, as the WTO has continued to add members over the decades, and especially with the advent of changing the GATT to the WTO in the 1990s, adding a lot more members post-World War II. Vast majority of the countries of the world now are members of the WTO. There are just like widely divergent trade interests between countries. And in recent years, we've seen the rise of the Global South, and Global South countries like China represents itself as a Global South developing country in the World Trade Organization. But not just China. India has been a big player. Brazil has been a big player. Even South Africa has been a big player in these negotiations. And what we see is really like a standstill in any kind of progress in moving the WTO forward. The most recent trading round of the WTO is called the Doha round, sometimes nicknamed the development round, because it was supposed to be a grand bargain between the global north and the global south on issues of international trade. Nobody's going to tell you from the WTO officially that Doha is dead, but I'm here to say it today. Doha's dead. It's just like at a university, nobody ever declares that a capital campaign, a fundraising campaign, has like failed and therefore it's over. They don't say that. It just kind of quietly recedes into the background. It's the same thing with the development round at the WTO. So we get these unprecedented division between global north and global south countries, but then also recently, between the United States and the rest of the world about tariffs, about the Trump administration's tariffs, either in the first term or the second term, especially. Tariffs are against the WTO's principles, and the WTO is in a lot of ways kind of powerless to stop them or to do anything about them. But we can talk about that if you would like to. And then I would say like purpose. There's a big purpose problem here. Does the international community still want to promote free trade at a truly global level? Or is the future of free trade, to the extent that we're interested in free trade, regional, like NAFTA and post-NAFTA agreements? Or is it even just bilateral between you and your allies, and you cut a trade deal with individual countries on an individual basis? Last one, and I'll go quickly here because I want to give some time for discussion. European Union. I think we see this in a lot of the headlines out of European countries. I mean, in recent years, in the last decade especially, we've seen growing Eurosceptic and kind of nationalist parties within European countries and even within the parliament of the European Union. And we've just seen growing divides between these in the parliament of the EU, but also just within these countries. And every time these countries have national or even regional elections, we see kind of a divide between nationalists / Eurosceptics and the more traditional EU enthusiasts. And so a lot of people say nationalism is breaking apart the EU, or there's been unprecedented pushback in recent years to the European project. And that then speaks to purpose. Do the countries of Europe still want to be united? And even if they want to have a united front on some things and in some negotiations, that's quite different from the question of do they want to be unified? And I have to tell a lot of my students now that are, thing that they don't tell you when you become a professor. Students keep getting younger every year. And I'm like, when were you guys born? And they're like, 2020, and I'm like, that can't be possible anymore. So it's not quite that bad yet. But they look at the European Union and they say, why did anybody ever think that this thing was going to work or had hope? And I was like, well, that's because you're just seeing it in the most recent years. You're just seeing the troubled times. I remember, like, when I was in college and grad school and stuff in the early 2000s, people were talking about the United States of Europe. This is the world's next superpower. And if Europe does this well, hey, South America is going to do it. Maybe Africa is going to do it with an African Union, and so on. And so, but I think I think there is a crisis of purpose in Europe. Do we even want this thing anymore? Do we want to keep giving it power, or are states just going to try to slowly start taking back, clawing back some of their traditional sovereign rights and purposes? So that's my crash course on the institutions of the liberal international order. Obviously, I put a lot on your plate. I threw a lot at you today. Happy to talk about, as detailed as you want to go on any of these organizations, or look at the broader kind of picture and the broader context of these organizations and the liberal world order more generally. Thanks very much.
So, Kyle, thanks so much. Question for you. Some of the critiques leveled at what is happening right now are we're approaching a unilateralist phase of complete contempt for multilateral organizations. And one is, the other is sovereigntist, which is that sovereigntism seeks to replace rules with force as an organizing principle. And Ann Applebaum in Autocracy, Inc. frames this emerging world order where autocracies are working to undermine things. So the question is the Board of Peace an attempt to normalize these shifts from multilateral international order toward one of an illiberal hegemony? And what should the EU and other traditional alliances do to counter this?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I have a good. My students keep asking me too about the Board of Peace, the Trump's Board of Peace. And I honestly can't figure out if the Board of Peace is something that they are actually serious about, or if this is just kind of an idea of the week or an idea of the month that is going to get kind of discarded into the background going forward. But I will say that, okay, I'm trying to think about how to answer this question. Here's how I will answer it. Even within the liberal international order and all of these institutions, one thing that you might notice is that I think there is a tension in and across these organizations. And the tension is this, are these meant to be organizations that are for everybody, regardless of your political regime type at home? Autocratic, democratic, theocratic, monarchical, everything in between? Or are these supposed to be organizations that are primarily by and for liberal democracies, liberal states, in kind of the classic liberal Western tradition? And I would say, depending on the organization, different answers to those. I think the UN is the ultimate classic. It is supposed to be for everybody. It is supposed to be for states that look very diverse and very different internally in their governmental and economic practices. Whereas on the opposite end, NATO, and maybe even the EU, we can say, I mean, in a lot of ways, founded explicitly on democratic principles of governance and meant to be by and for liberal states in the world. And so I guess it depends. So a lot of people are pointing to, the United States' traditional closest allies have been countries that, not coincidentally, look internally a lot like the United States, or look a lot more like the United States than other countries of the world. And one of the ways in which people have been uncomfortable with the United States in recent years, and maybe particularly under the Trump administrations, has been a seeming interest in, and even maybe coziness with, some of these non-democratic states and autocratic states of the world, and kind of a camaraderie and respect that the US president seems to have for leaders like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, and whether or not that is reciprocated or not. And so, but I think it depends on one's perspective about how critical democratic governance within countries is for the liberal international order and for these institutions, okay? If you think that that is absolutely critical, and that these institutions, this whole edifice is going to crumble if, autocratic influences are given more of a voice, more of a seat at the table, more pride of place in the US kind of hierarchy of allies and such, then yeah, this looks terrible. But if you think that the world order needs to become more pluralistic, and if we truly want to have an international community, it has to take diverse states, diverse political regime types into account, then I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing or a crisis point.
So we have a question from our partners at Mirabella in the audience, and then we'll look for a question in the room. You talked about the EU. Can you speak to how immigration trends have affected the rise of nationalism versus sort of the United States of Europe approach of the EU?
Yeah, I mean, just like in this country, I think immigration is one of the maybe the single greatest source of backlash and kind of resurgent nationalism and Euroscepticism. And I think that's because at a visceral level, I mean, controlling who is in your country is one of the most basic and understandable and tangible aspects of sovereignty, of a national government, of freedom of action. And I'm not trying to make any political statement here in saying that, but just saying that, like, I think to a lot of people, however they come down on immigration, they say, well, if we don't know who's in our country, or we can't control who is in our country and who has the full rights of being in the country, what is our country? What are borders? Who are we? What is our identity? And so I think in the European Union example, that has been probably the most contentious place of negotiations over further integration, and where the EU has really stalled and I think backtracked in a lot of ways, because I think a lot of countries said, yes, we like all this other stuff. We like the common market. We like eliminating barriers to trade between our countries, and even coordinating on other major aspects of our politics and our economy and our way of life and stuff. But it seems like a bridge too far, the free movement of peoples and the ability of peoples to work in other countries. And I will just also say that whether it's in Europe, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in any other part of the world, in hard economic times, when the middle classes and the lower classes are feeling the squeeze, people understandably are looking for someone or something to blame. And immigration is always, or at least usually, where like blame number one goes. We see increasingly people don't look like us, people don't share our values, and things don't look like they looked when I was a kid here. And when I was a kid, I remember better economic times than what we have now, and it's got to be part of this kind of multiculturalism, or this push to water down our national identity and bring a lot more people in. So rightly or wrongly, I think that's a major part of it.
You have said part of the problem with the international liberal order was essentially between interests of countries. I'd like to look at internally. There was a tremendous criticism both from the left and the right of the international liberal order because of things like the elimination of non-tariff barriers, and which undermined environmental, financial, labor regulation, and that there was a whole critique both on the left and the right that essentially a cosmopolitan elite, the so-called Epstein class now, are the people who benefited and not the average person within these countries. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would say that this is what I tell my students too, that and you're absolutely right about the disillusionment over free trade and globalization. It crosses a lot of these organizations, hits the World Trade Organization the hardest, but crosses a lot of the other organizations that I talk about. And what I say is, you can't beat the math of free trade at a macro level, okay? You can't beat the math of classical economics and comparative advantage. That if everybody specializes in that which they are most efficient at producing, principles of comparative advantage, and then freely exchanges that with other societies and countries, everybody's going to end up with more utility, more stuff. The big problem with that, or the big complication, is those benefits, those gains are not distributed equally, okay? And we're treating, even in my metaphor here, we're treating people like they're the same as countries. Countries as they're the same as people, okay? But that's not the case. The dark side of free trade and globalization is that your country's economic sectors and industries that are deemed to not be competitive once you open up internationally, international market forces, and are seen as inefficient, fall by the wayside. And what does that look like? That looks like hundreds, maybe thousands of people put out of work. Think about the Rust Belt countries. Think about the decimation of Detroit and the automobile sector in the United States. And I often say with free trade, oftentimes the benefits of free trade are dispersed and modest, like a lot of the things we buy, whether it's our clothes or our electronic devices, are slightly cheaper than they would be in an alternative reality where everything had to be made at home, versus concentrated pain. And the concentrated pain is the displacement of people losing their livelihoods. And the people that are displaced by free trade or put out of work by free trade, that's all they're going to remember is that I lost my job because of NAFTA, or I lost my job because of the World Trade Organization, or because of these other things. And I want to get to your other point too. Another criticism of free trade is that it values efficiency and it values free trade over principles of what we think of fair trade, trade that keeps in mind other ethics, other values that we prioritize. So labor standards, laws about work and a minimum wage, a fair wage, and safe factory conditions, and laws about how many hours people can work and how young they can work. Environmental conditions and standards about how much you can pollute in producing things, how many chemicals your factory can dump into a river or send up into the air. And the problem in the search for comparative advantage around the world is that the argument is free trade not only is indifferent to those things, but it actually incentivizes a race to the bottom in environmental and labor standards, because for a lot of countries, especially the global south, what's their comparative advantage? Cheap labor and non-existent environmental standards, which means they can produce things in their factories for a lot cheaper than we can do in the West or in the global North. And so, yeah, it's a huge problem. It is a huge problem. And I do think that there was just this naive belief, naive now, maybe understandable at the time, maybe not even understandable at the time. You can tell me about that. But that the results were going to trickle down to everybody, and that everybody was going to understand the benefits of this, and that even if auto workers lost their jobs in Detroit, well, we can quickly pivot and have job training programs and get those people trained as software engineers, or now, like, building AI data centers and things. And I think the reality is just like the world doesn't work that fast. The world doesn't look like it looks on a spreadsheet. And real pain and displacement takes time. And even if it doesn't take time, it takes something out of you. And there's a visceral reaction to it when you lose your livelihood or you think your way of life is going away. That can't be reduced to numbers and kind of utility maximization. So hope that answered your question, but thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarks. Question really about what's happening in your field in terms of identifying international organizations. I mean, your presentation was great today, but it's sort of, look what's happening about all these organizations that were created in a world flattened by World War II, and the U.S. was the dominant power. Now, 70 years later, geez, things aren't the same as they were. So what are the new replacements coming up? I mean, the WTO was looking at a lot of things like environment, like investment, like IPR. they would still like to focus on those types of things as global rights, but now China's a player. Belt and Road might be a new international organization. In the trade area, NAFTA, trade agreements in Africa, that kind of thing. So your analysis today, understandably, was very static. And I'm just wondering if your field is looking dynamically, what's coming up to replace, even if it's just regional?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I will try my best at it. But you're absolutely right, and so actually just to kind of plug my own research and the way that I look at things, this is why I don't the reason that I decided to talk about kind of the liberal order and kind of international orders more generally is that I do think we need to not miss the forest for the trees. So I could just stand up here and talk about individual organizations all the time, but I think the concept of order makes sense because even though these are all separate organizations, they are interconnected and there are interconnected principles between them. And so, I think it's important to see that they were all born kind of in the shadow of American preponderance or American hegemony. Now, so in my field, there are debates about this. I would say that there is a view that has still been dominant, at least up until recent years in Washington and in the State Department and a lot of parts of the executive branch, actually, that the liberal order and the international organizations of the liberal order were going to have staying power. And that is because they were codified and they are not just a reflection of American power or Western power, but they had buy-in from other countries of the world. And even if there were problems, other countries had representation in them. So a lot of times this was called in a debate kind of the China wager. And the China wager was that, well, China went from kind of a third rate, in a lot of ways, backwards developmentally power to a superpower on the brink of superpower status in a generation or less. And it did so not through defying these institutions, but through acting within them. China likes these organizations, and therefore they are going to keep them. Now, they might adjust things at the margins, but I think kind of the triumphalist view and story of the liberal order is even as the United States inevitably declines in influence and relative power in the world, these organizations, this order has staying power because they have legitimacy, they have buy-in. And I would just say that is something that I have disagreed with and continue to disagree with. And I think a number of other commentators that study these things are. I'm not saying I'm at the forefront of this, but I've been a longtime skeptic about this, and that's because I do think that when power and influence change, it's naive to think that new rising powers and interests like China, maybe like the rest of the BRICS countries, are going to want the same institutions and the same rules that the United States and its traditional allies wanted after World War II. And so I feel like in some ways this entire debate and this entire question has come to the forefront because of the Trump administration. Both versions of it, and whatever you think of Trump, whatever you think of the international organizations that we're talking about, like them or hate them, I think everybody would agree that Trump has demonstrated, at least rhetorically, a much more hostility and skepticism towards the institutions of the liberal world order than previous presidents. And so a lot of people have kind of woken up to this and said, wow, look at these organizations aren't working. Well, let me tell you, I would say even without Trump, they weren't working before for a lot of the world. There is a lot of dissatisfaction about these things. And I think kind of the presidency of Joe Biden was an interesting natural experiment because it was kind of going back to the rhetoric of pre-Trump 1.0 and saying, all this is fine, okay? All this is fine. The benefits of globalization will trickle down. The people that are against it don't understand it. multiculturalism, kind of like one world, one interconnected world. This is all working for us, okay? And people still like American leadership, American hegemony, and Western or global Northern dominance of these organizations. I'm saying that's not the case. And so even if you dislike, the Trump administration, I think one useful thing has been to kind of take off this veneer of everything is well with these organizations, because I don't think that everything's well. To answer your question, I think, as China rises and other powers rise, I think we're going to see more initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative. I often describe the Belt and Road Initiative as kind of China trying to do the Marshall Plan in a lot of ways. It is a public relations campaign, but it's also a massive influence campaign in the form of economic development packages, bilateral deals for China to put its stamp on a lot of the world, the global south and developing world in particular. I think we should expect to see more of that, not less. And I would also say that as these global organizations and institutions stall, stymie, face crises of illegitimacy, we are seeing more and more the rise of regional organizations and regional solutions, and organizations that are often mimicking the global organizations, but on a regional level, whether it's in Africa or Southeast Asia, Latin and South America, and so on. I think we can expect to see more of that too. But I would say the future is probably going to be more fragmentation, more contestation within and outside of these organizations, rather than just some simple solution. If you think the solution is just get Trump out of power and elect Democrats, that might have its virtues for other things that you're interested in. I don't think it's going to solve these problems. Okay, so. Yeah.
All right. Big hand for Kyle Lascurettes. And I can't think of a better way to end the series this year, because this illustrates exactly that great decisions require great questions. So thank you for your questions. If you want to see to Scott's question, what the peers and the youngins are thinking, I encourage you to look forward to April, when Lewis and Clark does their International Affairs Symposium, which is the oldest, largest student-run international affairs symposium in the country. And there is always great discussion, and it is completely run by the young minds who are going to be running the world. So, support that. Also, reminder that if you want to review any of these programs, they are on our YouTube channel, the WorldOregon YouTube channel, and I'm also asking a big favor, which is, can you go when you view them and click the subscribe button? It's not like, the Columbia Record House where you're going to get things in the mail. It is so easy. There's no obligation. It helps us get our numbers up. We're trying to get up to over 1,000 so we can participate in this global economic juggernaut of social media and do more like this and reach more people. So thank you, all of you, for being here, and we will see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.